Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining the webinar today. My name is Brian Mahone. I serve as EHD Insurance's cyber liability specialist and will actually be today's moderator and one of our three panelists as well. We'll be recording today's webinar and we'll have time for some live Q&A at the end as well. So our agenda today will kind of take us through a three-person panel of subject matter experts on cyber insurance, IT security, and privacy law. We'll each kind of discuss the issues we see small to mid-sized businesses face in navigating these kind of three areas of compliance, provide some tips and trends and updates for 2022. So I've already introduced myself, but joining me today is Devin Chastwick of McNeese, Wallace & Nurick, and Bob Pacheco of Mission Cyber Group. Bob's a seasoned IT and security professional with extensive experience in training in information security, organizational security, compliance, governance, program development, risk assessments. He has served as a security manager for a ton of different industries, Fortune 100 companies, state entities, sports, entertainment brands, and is a wealth of knowledge. We'll also hear from Devin of McNeese Wallace, and he's an attorney by trade and serves as actually the chair of the privacy and data security group at McNeese. He actually began working on cybersecurity issues back in 2005. Where he represented banks to recover credit card replacement costs from national retailers who failed to safeguard that data. So his clients actually prevailed in some of the first successful data breach lawsuits in U.S. federal courts. So without further ado, just to kind of set the scene here, everybody on this webinar really has heard of big data breaches in the news, like Facebook and Uber and Colonial Pipeline. But the truth is, cyber attacks are more likely to affect small to mid-sized businesses. So this CNBC article here. Oh, sorry, I forgot to change my slides here. There's our three panelists, but this CNBC article went viral a few years back that 60% of small businesses will go out of business within 6 months of a breach. And last year in 2021, ransomware kind of led the way for how these threat actors were attacking businesses. That's ticked down slightly. And 2022, we've really seen business email compromise and funds transfer fraud or wire fraud take center stage. One of our cyber carriers here called Coalition actually noted that the first half of 2022, phishing accounted for 58% of reported claims, which was a 32% increase from the last half of 2021. With the average cost a small business owner faced from a phishing attack was about $140,000. So it's no surprise really that things had to change. This increase in both frequency and severity of again phishing, ransomware, funds transfer fraud really pushed the cyber liability insurance marketplace into what we call a hard market, and that's basically a fancy term for saying that prices are going up. In 2021 and 2022. They went up roughly 20 to 200%. There's not great data out just yet for 2023. We should see a leveling off, not necessarily flat renewals or a decrease in premiums, but slight increases compared to the prior year or so. But across the board, this hard market has been pushing kind of retentions and deductibles to increase. Terms are getting worse. Carriers are pulling out of the cyber insurance marketplace. New ones are entering, which is good. And entire industries or classes of business are being abandoned, and some cyber liability policy language is changing. We'll get into that a little bit further. But this graph on the right just shows kind of the top 20 cyber insurance carriers. I believe the top 5 were not making an underwriting profit. Their combined ratio is above 100, and that was back last year. Moving forward, some of the updates we'll see for 2022 to be aware of is, not all of these cyber policies are created equal, right? They don't have a standard industry standard form or skeleton or backbone of the policy form, right? So it truly takes a specialist to understand the differences, between carrier A and carrier B's cyber policies. And one of the ways they're limiting coverage or things to watch out for is cybercrime, right? The phishing, social engineering, funds transfer. You might see $1 million policy, but only maybe $100,000 worth of coverage for this type of crime. Ransomware, we're seeing limits get slashed, additional co-insurance, additional deductibles and retentions. So carriers are trying to shield themselves there. There's also something called the NIST, common vulnerabilities and exposure, and the kind of this idea of neglected software. Essentially, if your IT guy is asleep at the wheel, and you slowly start losing cyber liability coverage as that known software vulnerability goes unpatched. So we've seen limits go from half or zero over a course of a year. So something to look out for. There's another item out there preferred as bricking. You can think of it as hardware replacement. So sometimes companies have a data breach that's so bad, right, that their laptop, their cell phone, their server, their endpoints, their hardware is rendered useless. It's as useless as a brick. That's where the term comes from. So carriers are shielding themselves from that as well with sublimits. And then the last one has a fun name, cryptojacking. This is a cyber crime where a cyber criminal will kind of secretly use a company's computing power or network to mine for cryptocurrencies. And what that does is that jacks up your electricity bill or your IT kind of internet bill. So we're seeing carriers sublimit that type of coverage and causing issues in buried within their cyber policy. Moving forward, I wanted to touch briefly on cyber insurance by industry, right? Everybody hears of it in the news. Maybe they've had a loss themselves, or their board of directors, if they have a data breach, could be on the hook for not taking care of the company, looking out for shareholders. A lot of obstacles we face and what I specialize in at EHD is obviously doing cyber risk assessments and helping our clients understand exposures, but also ripping those cyber policies apart and understanding the coverage. And then the cost is going up, so that's a concern. And we're seeing a big uptick in the manufacturing distributor space, professional services, lawyers, accountants, CPAs, as well as public entities or small townships or school districts. These industries are getting very difficult to underwrite. They're getting hit harder by cyber liability, and really why is they typically have lower IT budgets or don't have an extensive cybersecurity budget, or they also work with big entities, right? So a lot of these threat actors can kind of hunt the low-hanging fruit, so to speak, and use the small and mid-sized companies to get into to the larger ones. I'll touch on a couple more slides and then turn things over to Bob here, but I wanted to touch on just 3 articles out there out in the news regarding cyber insurance. Obviously, one is the war in Ukraine and Russia, and there's not great data on this because most of it's probably top secret, but when the war first started, there was kind of fears that U.S. sanctions imposed on Russia would lead to an increase in cyber attacks on the U.S. as retaliation, essentially. In reality, we're seeing Russia-backed cyber threat actors focus more internally, kind of against Ukraine. And there's a couple other trains of thought where, as the environment in the Ukraine and Russia becomes more unstable, that more day-to-day people will turn to cybercrime as a way to support themselves financially, and kind of utilizing Russia as a safe haven. The implications with cyber liability policies is a lot of times they have what we call war exclusions. So these are kind of facing new scrutiny in the marketplace, and they're being reworded kind of as it pertains to cyber attacks, because many of them are unfortunately kind of state-backed and connected to war. The second one is an article, and we'll send these slides out afterwards, is a big cyber insurance carrier I won't name on the webinar today, but essentially they're facing a huge lawsuit against a mid-sized manufacturing company that Basically, the carrier is claiming misrepresentation that when this manufacturer went to go apply for cyber insurance, they didn't fill out their multi-factor authentication application correctly. They basically said they had MFA, come claim time they didn't, so the carrier is denying the claim. I'm sure we'll see more of these. I always recommend whoever's filling out those applications, whether it's a CFO or a business owner, to get IT involved from the start, not on the back end, and treat those applications, even if they say yes, no, as if they're fill in the blank, right? You know, these cyber insurance applications are written mostly by legal people or insurance people, not IT people. So sometimes when IT folks read them, the questions don't make sense to them, because it's a more nuanced answer. So always be as honest as you can and fill out as much information as you can. The last one is about a law that was passed in North Carolina. I'm sure Devin can touch on this a little bit more in detail, but this concept of making it illegal for state agencies or local governments, including public schools, to pay a ransom following a ransomware attack. So there's kind of this debate going on in certain circles if that's good or bad. But it could create what we refer to as triple extortion situation, where essentially a cyber criminal encrypts a company's network and then demand payment, but they also steal the data and use it as blackmail for an entity paying the ransom and not sharing that with authorities. So not a good situation. Cyber threats and extortion and ransomware is evolving. It's important to note that on top of all of this, these cyber insurance carriers are scrutinizing IT controls, as most of you are probably aware. So I thought this graph did a great job of depicting that. I won't go through all of these, but essentially you want to be, if you're not in the red, you need to get in the red as soon as possible with the IT controls your company has. The big ones here are MFA, across email, on-site, off-site, whether it's you're using a VPN or remote desktop protocol. They want it on privileged access, who has access to kind of the secret sauce of the company, maybe the CFO or the business office, IT administrator access, email, and then just company network. So there's kind of, it's not, do you have MFA? Yes, no, it's more across 4 different layers. And then obviously backups are important. You don't have to pay a ransomware. If you have great backups, you just restore from backup. And then there's another protection called endpoint detection and response that I won't get into detail, but that's becoming incredibly important. And you'll note that on this list, not all of these are IT security controls are technological or software based. Many are kind of process and procedure based. So with that in mind, I wanted to hand things over to Bob, who will kind of get into the problem with compliance and what trends he sees with clients. So if you give me a moment here, I think I'll have to unmute him.
Can you hear me?
I can hear you. Take it over, Bob.
All right, cool. So you're on that slide.
Yes.
Yeah. All right. So in support to what Brian just went through, and I apologize that my video is not coming through. I'm just having technical issues there. But to kind of speak to that, one of the things that dealing with a lot of the customers that I've done over the years, and I've been working security for close to over 20 years, is that they tend to look at managing their compliance, their security services, a lot of their stuff as a kind of like, okay, we have to take care of it this month, we have to take care of that later this year. But they don't look at it like kind of like a Deming circle, kind of you have to do things, you have to review them, you have to update them. And so most of what we're speaking to are like listed in gold. So we're going to be talking and have been talking about requirements and assessment, what's going out there. So when Brian is talking about these different kinds of attacks, that's kind of a little mini assessment saying, okay, these are the things that you have to protect yourself against. When you're looking at privacy requirements for insurance, those are requirements that you have to put in place. And then later on when Devin kind of speaks about privacy and compliance stuff, it goes to those 2 areas. Those 2 areas feed into operations. So basically you want to align a lot of what you have in place straight into what's required, what compliance is, and create the right technology to help deal with that circumstances. And technology is key. So something that you probably will hear about, you've heard mention of ransomware. That seems to be a very key term today. And it probably will be for a while. It evolves, it becomes more advanced, and it does create different things. That's a requirement for businesses to be able to defend against. So that requirement then feeds into the operations that goes, okay, so how do we defend against ransomware? What kind of backup strategies do we have? What do we have in respect to detection software, protection capabilities, all of this, which will be, you know, kind of explored a little bit later on. Their response to a requirement to come from the assessment of what's necessary. In addition to that, a lot of you may have privacy compliance, like, and I'm just using this as an example, like GDPR. That will also create a set of requirements that have to be met. How do you handle, you know, requests for information? How do you protect your customer or information? And also, what compliance, you know, GDPR is a big one, but you have CCPR and all this other stuff out there. With that said, they feed into operations. Once you have your operations kind of defined, then you have to test its recoverability. How do you restore from a disaster? Because some of you will eventually have a security breach or a security incident. The statistics are too strong for that. And so your backup process not only will help you against a ransomware attack, but it's designed for recoverability. But when I'm looking at that area, it's focused on your technology and the process to restore and respond to those security attacks. Continuing using ransomware, once you have a good recoverability technology, you want to validate it, and that's where security testing and resiliency testing comes in there. Perhaps the most important component of this cycle, which is a requirement to do by some compliance, is to validate that what you have in place makes sense based on your business context and capabilities. Yeah, I can see it. So, and then once you have the assessment, compliance, operations, validations, you go you update your plans, you get new technology, which feeds into your new requirements, and you rinse and repeat this. The reason I'm going through this to some level of detail is that it's not sufficient to wait until the end of the year to do pen testing, because you have to get it done. It's not sufficient to just do that assessment to show that you get it done. The idea of these compliance standards and the reality of today, and what's being pushed by the government and a lot of organizations out there that focus on security, is not to be 100% protected, is to have a process that basically forces or compels you to do an assessment, look at your requirements, think through it very thoughtfully, see what you need for operations based on those requirements. You do not have to get best of breed for everything. From a security perspective, you just want to be able to have some sort of tripping wire against all those attacks that make sense for the organization that you have and at the size that you have. And then you want to kind of test it once you have that in place. You want to test its ability to recover from a real disaster. You also want to test that those operational tools are working. You update it based on those testing, you make it into new requirements, and you go around and around. One of the questions that I've gotten in the past in respect to this is, how do you, this seems very complicated. This might be expensive. Everything in here that I just went through is very scalable to whatever size of the organization. So if you're IBM, it's expensive because you have an expensive profile. But if you're a smaller organization, this can be achieved very cost effectively with lower grade tools that are sufficient for what you have. And you just go around and around. Your goal is not to be 100% secure, is to show that you have some sort of security management system, and you're doing your due diligence and due care, and you're doing what a prudent person would do at the size of your organization. So with that said, I just want to kind of put a kind of a primer to what was said earlier and what was going on in there, what's going to be coming next. So if there's any question, I think Brian will lead that to the end. So I'm pretty much done.
All right, thanks everyone. This is Devin Chawostik at McNeese, Wallace & Nurick. Thanks for the introduction, Brian. So I'm an attorney, and the first question a lot of people ask is, what do I need an attorney for in the cybersecurity space when I've got IT experts like Bob involved, and I have the backing of my insurance company like EHD and Brian's work on the cyber liability side. So my practice is focused in three areas. Number one, I advise companies on compliance with emerging privacy laws. You've heard a reference from Bob to several of those. The first to hit was in 2018 with the EU's General Data Protection Regulation, and companies who don't do business in Europe were largely able to keep their heads buried in the sand on these issues until the California Consumer Privacy Act took effect a year later. That's California's version of what I call a proactive privacy law, meaning this is not a law that governs what happens if you have a data breach, but a law that governs what data you're allowed to collect from consumers, what disclosures you need to make in your privacy policy or elsewhere before collecting that information, and what kind of internal security and procedures you need to have in place to protect that data. So there's a lot of legal drivers. California was the first, but starting January 1st, 2023, we have consumer privacy laws that will be taking effect in Colorado, Virginia, Connecticut, and Utah. And the similar laws are under consideration in many other states. So there's always changes in the law that we need to interpret for our clients, and we help provide guidance on what sort of programs they should have in place to comply with those laws. The second part of my job, unfortunately, is working with clients and responding to data security breaches. Presently working with a client on a ransomware breach. You heard Bob mention ransomware and the fact that it remains a leading threat. This is probably the fourth or fifth data incident that I've handled in the last year involving a client of the firm who was affected by ransomware. So we work with clients in the entire data breach process, from how I'll give you an idea of how this normally works from the sample that I'm working on presently. The client discovers that they have an issue. In the case of ransomware, you come into the office and your screens show a message from the threat actor. Threat actor is just the fancy term we use in the IT security community to refer to the bad guys. Those bad guys are usually hackers overseas in Russia, former Russian republics, sometimes China or North Korea. They spread ransomware, which is just a type of computer malware or computer virus that encrypts data. So it locks your systems and prevents you from accessing the data you have stored on those systems or using those systems. So usually a client or a business that's been affected will be referred to me when that hits and they don't know what to do. We usually will step into that breach and secure technical assistance. So a firm like Bob's firm that's well-versed in handling cybersecurity incidents. Two notes on that. First, we usually retain that firm on behalf of our clients. That's so that the IT firm will report to McNeese. And the value in that is that the reports and conclusions of the IT investigation will be masked by the attorney-client privilege, because we're providing, they're providing their information to us so that we can effectively advise our client. Why is that important? You do not want to directly hire an IT firm and have them report to you and your business, because if after the notification process you face any claims, whether those are class action litigation claims, direct claims by individual consumers who are affected, or a government investigation, the report, if it's made directly to the victim of the breach, the business that's the victim of the breach, that report's discoverable in litigation. And that means that the government agency investigating you or the plaintiff's firm that's brought a class action against your business is going to be able to discover that report through the litigation process or the government investigation process. And that report is going to be very sensitive, because it's going to lay out exactly what happened and how it happened and why it happened. And usually that's because either someone in the organization made a mistake clicking on a link, opening an attachment because they weren't properly trained, or there was a security flaw. You'd failed to adopt some of those measures that Bob described. And you're essentially then giving the investigator or opposing counsel a roadmap as to why your organization was negligent and failed to properly protect the information. And that means that you could face fines, penalties, and civil damages in litigation. So we retain the IT expert. We get the IT expert. And let me touch on that for a second. You do not want to rely on your internal IT teams in these incidents, as effective and trusted as they may be. It's not their job to properly respond to one of these incidents. They're not going to have the in-depth knowledge of ransomware variants and what's out there. They're also probably not going to have the expertise to recover your systems while preserving the logs and other information that tell us what happened. And that's important. In addition to that, I would not rely on necessarily the local IT vendor who may have set up your email server or maintains your website for the same reasons. They don't have the technological expertise to work to restore systems while simultaneously preserving evidence. Why is that about? You might say, well, we don't want to preserve evidence because that's just going to lead to what we did wrong. But I had a recent incident where a client's systems were shut down by a local IT vendor who had, what's really a natural and forgivable response. We're just going to overwrite the affected systems and we're going to restore from a backup. But when they overwrote those systems, they destroyed the logs that might have shown us the nature and extent of the intrusion. And where that leaves us is we don't know whether the bad guys access just one email account or if they let their fingers do the walking through the entire system and all the servers. And that means we can't contain the scope of the incident. If we preserve the logs and we can conduct a proper investigation, in many instances, we're able to reach a conclusion that sensitive, personally identifiable information, protected health information, the types of data that trigger notification obligations may in fact not have been affected by the incident. And so notification's not required and you're essentially off the hook. If we don't have that kind of log data preserved, we sometimes have to assume the worst. And that means every bit of personally identifiable information on your systems, we assume to be compromised. And you're notifying thousands, tens of thousands, or hundreds of thousands of individuals. That means word is going to get out of the incident into the media. It's going to harm the reputation of your business and pose the threat of those lawsuits and government investigations. So working with a firm like Bob, that's an accredited and sophisticated IT security vendor offering services specifically to victims of data breaches, is very important. So turning to my slides here, in advising clients on the appropriate measures that they should undertake to protect their data, Bob and IT vendors are very naturally focused on the hard IT defenses and systems that set up your perimeter and protect your information from external threats. And that is a vital piece of this. From the legal perspective and the compliance perspective, when we're building out a privacy compliance program to meet those different legal obligations, we're really focused internally on internal policies and procedures and practices. So on the screen here, you see, a list of really for a not necessarily for a small business, but for any medium-sized business, especially a business that's dealing directly with consumer information, protected health information, or other sensitive and confidential information, this is sort of the suite of policies that we most commonly develop on behalf of our clients. Some of these are externally facing, like a website privacy policy and a website terms of use. The privacy policies where you disclose to individuals what data you collect, what you do with it, who you share it with, whether you sell it or not. The terms of use are sort of the inverse of that. That's you telling consumers what they're allowed to do on your systems, what they're allowed to use your services for, and preventing abuse of your services and systems. The internally facing policies are in the first column, the policies that your employees should know about and see. So an overall data security policy that goes right into your employee handbook is the first step. I compare a data security policy from a legal perspective to a workplace harassment policy. You know, most medium-sized and larger businesses are going to have documented policies in their employee handbook that tell employees, this is a safe workplace. We care about the safety and consideration of our workforce. And if you're abusive, whether that's harassment, sexual harassment, or just abusive conduct or physical violence, you know, those kind of violations of a workplace harassment policy are going to subject you to discipline up to and including termination of your employment. Why do we have those policies, workplace harassment policies? Number one, we want to have a safe and secure workforce for our people. Number two, we want to be able to defend ourselves if there's a sexual harassment or other workplace harassment lawsuit by saying there was a policy and a procedure in place that employees can follow to report such conduct. And if this conduct had been reported, we would have promptly taken action and fired or taken other disciplinary action against the employee who was victimizing others. Data privacy, data security policy internally is very similar. It's meant to inform your workforce that we collect sensitive, personally identifiable, and other confidential information. We care about the security and propriety of that information. We care about our own confidential business data, and you're not permitted to share that information or use that information for purposes unrelated to your work duties. If you share information or fail to safeguard information, you'll be subject to discipline up to and including termination of employment. That's because the same goals as a workplace harassment policy. We want to protect our own data and our own business assets, and we want to have a defense if there's a claim brought against us because of a data breach or other misconduct, that we had a policy, that we were informing our workforce of our expectations, and if we had known of the violations of that policy, we would have disciplined the employees who are at fault. The other policies, you know, are kind of listed in order of significance. I'll highlight two of those: a breach response plan and incident response plan is vital. The last one on that list, a wire transfer policy. We've been focusing on ransomware, but the other big threat vector we see affecting clients is wire transfer fraud. So what we call man-in-the-middle email attacks, where people impersonate a vendor, a client, or others, and convince someone in your organization to send a wire transfer out and into an account for the bad guys, and they abscond with your funds. So informing your employees that they shouldn't send wire transfers if they don't know the recipient is important, and having them follow that policy is also important. Then we have some IT-facing policies that are more technical in nature that would really monitor and guide the behavior of your IT workforce. So I laid out sort of a general description of all the different privacy laws we have in place. So all 50 US states have what I call reactive breach notification laws that tell you if you suffer a data security incident that involves unauthorized access to certain categories of information, you need to notify the affected persons. Then beyond that, we have these proactive requirements in California, Connecticut, and the other states I mentioned earlier. For certain regulated industries, like the financial services industry, healthcare providers, there are additional state and federal laws that provide more specific requirements for safeguarding those categories of data. And if you're doing business outside of the United States, almost every other country is going to have data security and privacy laws that you'll need to follow. In addition to those legal statutory requirements, a lot of contracts now impose data security requirements. So whether you're working with a vendor and you want to guide their behavior, or you're working in partnership with a larger organization, very often your contracts will impose certain requirements on how you handle sensitive information. I talked about breach notification laws. I'll just highlight quickly the range of data that's protected by those breach notification laws varies significantly from state to state. In Pennsylvania, we've got a really sort of rudimentary data breach notification law. The only categories of information in Pennsylvania that trigger a notification obligation are credit card numbers, financial account numbers, social security numbers, or driver's license numbers. But many of the states in the US have expanded their breach notification laws to cover things like biometric data, so fingerprint scans, retina scans that are used for access to buildings, Another example would be, you see at the top of the screen here, many states require notification if there's a breach of a database that includes usernames or email addresses together with passwords. The reason for this is to prevent what we call credential stuffing, meaning one company is hacked, they steal the usernames and passwords that are used to log into that company's site, and then they try to recycle those usernames and passwords on bank sites or others. Because a lot of consumers just use the same usernames and passwords from site to site. So a lot of states now require notification if your site is hacked and usernames and passwords that are used for access to your services are stolen. Another example of the discrepancies in these state breach notification laws is whether they cover electronic data or also paper records. You've got several states that cover paper records that contain any of these listed categories of information in addition to electronically stored data. So every time there's a breach, we have the fun job of parsing each state of residence of each affected person and determining whether the categories of data at issue trigger a notification obligation. Here in red, you see the states that have passed privacy laws, but you also see in blue states where similar laws have been introduced and are currently under consideration, including Pennsylvania. We expect this wave to continue to build across the country, at least until there's a federal privacy law that's put in place, which seems unlikely at present. So the states are the leaders on privacy requirements, and again, it puts us and our clients in the lovely position of having to interpret data privacy requirements that may vary from state to state depending on where the company does business, where it has clients, customers, and from where it's collecting personally identifiable and other sensitive information. So the California Consumer Privacy Act I'll use as an example because these other state laws largely mirror CCPA. So the California Consumer Privacy Act applies to any entity that does business in California, which really just means selling or delivering products, having physical locations, employees or offices, or otherwise interacting with the state. If you have revenues of more than $25 million a year, or you collect personal information, even if that's just a name of 50,000 or more residents of California in a year. The laws, all of these new state laws are defining personal information a lot more broadly than social security number and financial account number. In California, it's any information that could identify an individual. That means the stuff that we used to see in the white pages of the phone book, name and phone number, that's considered personal information under the California law and all these other state laws that have followed it. So if you're collecting even just rudimentary name and email address or phone number or mailing address, you still need to provide privacy disclosures and otherwise follow the statutory requirements. Those requirements are, number one, a notice at the point of collection. So that's your privacy policy and an opt-in when people enter their information into a website or otherwise provide information to you. You need to provide disclosures of rights that consumers have with regard to control of their information. So consumers are now allowed to request that you delete their information or provide copies of information that you've collected, and you need to notify them of those rights. The two that, going beyond just a privacy policy, these laws require if you share consumer data with vendors or partners, or you're selling consumer data to other entities, you need to disclose that. And you also need to have contractual requirements in place with those partners and vendors or other entities that limit their use of that data and require them to comply with the Consumer Privacy Act. There's also employee training requirements. There's requirements for safeguarding data to have some of those hard IT assets and protections in place that Bob discussed. And there's one notable thing that I'll highlight that I think a lot of companies are really not up to speed on, even larger companies. These laws require that companies conduct and document a risk assessment anytime that they're changing their practices with regard to the collection and use of consumer data. So if you expand your loyalty program to collect additional categories of data, before you do that, you need to consider, well, do we need this data? Does this fulfill a business purpose or advance a business purpose? And how do we weigh that business need and advantage versus the consumer's privacy rights? And do we feel we're adequately protecting the privacy of that information as we expand or offer new programs or services, or as we institute and adopt new technology? If we create a mobile app or any other kind of new avenue for collection of consumer data, risk assessments need to be conducted and documented. The California Consumer Privacy Act expanded starting January 1st, and this is causing a lot of upheaval for our clients. It used to only apply to consumer data as we traditionally think of it. So information that a consumer provides when they sign up for an email subscription or they buy a product online, and really just a B2C, business to consumer relationships. But starting January 1st, the California Act is going to be expanded to cover B2B contact information and employee information. So if you have employees in California, you'll need to update privacy policies and inform those employees of what data you're collecting, what you're doing with it, and provide them with the same rights that have already been extended to consumers. That's the case as well for B2B companies. So even if I struggle to come up with an example of something that's only B2B, I end up with like nuclear reactors, because consumers don't generally buy those. Let's say you're selling in the nuclear reactor business and you say, I've never had to worry about these consumer privacy laws because we don't collect consumer information. The only personally identifiable information that we're going to have is the engineering companies or the power companies that buy and install our products. As of January 1st, that B2B contact information is subject to the Consumer Privacy Act. So even if you're in a B2B sector, you need to be telling your business contacts what information you collect and providing with them with the rights that consumers have been provided with since the enaction of the CCP Act. So some practical tips building off of Bob's input. These are really more rudimentary than the IT focus, but for business people, if you're thinking about what can I do to sensibly protect my company and our systems, backups would be number one. You want to have many backups, so repetitious backups that go back for some period of time. Often we see ransomware get triggered that's been laying latent on the system for some period of time. So even if you have a backup from last week or last month, it might already be infected. So you want to have backups that go back for quite a period of time and back up repeatedly over that period of time. The second key thing I'd say is cyber liability insurance. You don't want to be bearing the cost of these incidents yourselves. You want to pass through those costs to an insurer, so make sure you have cyber liability coverage, and Brian is certainly well equipped to guide you on the various competing policies and coverages available. And I think the next thing I'd say is multi-factor authentication as a common sense and easy thing to adopt. You've probably by now have your credit card companies or your bank accounts. You'll see when you try to log in, even just like Ticketmaster now requires two-factor authentication, where you log into the site with a password and it'll send you a text message. That's to confirm that you're really you. So if your username and password are stolen, but the bad guys are in Russia, they try to log in, a text message is sent to your phone, they don't have your phone. So they don't get that text message except in really advanced and really sophisticated hacking efforts. They usually don't have access to that second factor of authentication, and that prevents them from logging in. So we use multi-factor authentication at our firm. We use a service called Duo, which sends a little buzz to a mobile app on your iPhone, and you have to click a button on that to approve your login. That means that even if my username and password went missing, nobody overseas who got access to that username and password could log into our law firm systems. That's a really key way to protect data. Training employees, again, I mentioned earlier. Testing systems, we advise companies at least annually to do a third-party, what's called penetration test, where you essentially hire someone like Bob's firm to try to hack your systems, and they come back with a report that says, here's the vulnerabilities we discovered, and here's our recommendations on how you can fix those vulnerabilities. You're testing your hard IT defenses. Same thing with training. We run phishing campaigns using a service called KnowBe4. There's others out there that send essentially fake phishing emails to employees. and tests whether they respond to those messages. If they do respond, then they can be retrained, and you can re-emphasize, here's how to recognize a phishing email, don't click on links and don't click on attachments. So those are the practical measures that we push our clients to adopt when we're building out their compliance programs. Brian, I'll turn it back to you.
Perfect. Everybody, feel free to use the chat to put any questions in. I did receive a couple privately. We have about 5, 10, 15 minutes remaining on our time today. But one question that came up was, how do I know if I need to report a data breach? And I can certainly chime in from kind of the cyber insurance perspective, but I think Devin, you'd probably would be better suited to kind of answer the difference between, an incident and a data breach.
Yeah, we're persnickety about the word breach on the legal side. You'll often hear attorneys in my role tell clients, don't use the B word. Very often, as soon as some kind of unexplained IT event happens, there's an assumption that, oh my God, we must have suffered a data breach. And there'll be emails going back and forth between leadership and IT saying, what's happening with the data breach? We don't like to use that term because it looks bad later in an investigation or litigation. But moreover, there's a real specific legal sense of the word breach. So a data security incident is anything that affects your systems that needs to be investigated. It's only if that investigation discovers that there was unauthorized access to personally identifiable information that we consider it a breach. And we consider it a breach only at the point where one of those state breach notification laws is triggered. So in Pennsylvania, you only have a data security breach if there's unauthorized access to unencrypted driver's license numbers, social security numbers, or financial account numbers. The bad guys could find all kinds of other stuff on your system that wouldn't trigger a breach notification obligation. So from a legal sense, a breach is a data security incident that triggers a notification obligation under laws that are applicable to the entity.
Awesome.
Hey, this is Bob. I just want to underscore something in there. A lot of times I've managed a lot of security incidents in the past, and IT will come in and they will believe, no, this is a breach because we have evidence that data has been out there. Even in that situation, don't use the word breach. Let the attorneys decide exactly what that breach is based on what he said, but just don't get overwhelmed by IT because they see breaches as something completely different.
Correct. Yeah, and from an insurance perspective, I mean, any good cyber insurance policy will have a 1-800 number incident response hotline, 24/7, 365, and usually that is manned by a law firm or a data breach coach that can, determine if that incident truly is a breach with, forensics and legal help. There are, also things in our world where you're not really submitting a claim on your policy, but you're submitting what we call a notice of circumstance, where you're saying, hey, carrier, this thing happened. I don't really know if it's a claim, but I don't want this to be, used against me in the future, so I'm letting you know about it. And we typically recommend our insureds to do that. One more question, and then I think we'll wrap up here. Says, how do I convince my company management of the importance of doing a tabletop exercise? I think that's a good one for you too, Devin.
Sure, yeah, and I'd like to hear Bob's input on this too, but I gave you that whole list of policies and procedures, and one of them was having an incident response plan. I almost caught myself and called it a breach response plan, but we say an incident response plan because it's triggered by any type of incident. So we've got some unexplained circumstances, some systems are down, we're trying to figure out why. What do we do next? And the incident response plan is a playbook. It's a flow chart, right? It's going to lead you through if this, then if X, then Y. So we've got a system outage. Who do we call? Do we have an IT vendor that we trust? And who is it? And are they available to provide services in quick order? So that guides you to your IT vendor, or maybe the first step is we're going to contact Devin at McNeese. because we want to make sure this is all covered by the privilege, even as we get into the basics of an IT investigation. Then, when do we call our insurer? When do we contact law enforcement? What do we do if we find out that systems are going to be down for 2 weeks? What do we do when we find out that all of our employees' social security numbers have been compromised? It's going to lead you from start to finish through an incident. But having that plan sitting on your system somewhere is not good enough. One great thing to test in a tabletop exercise is, what does the business do when their systems are encrypted? They say, well, we look at our incident response plan. Where's your incident response plan? Well, it's saved on our systems. So what are you going to do if an incident shuts your systems down? Where do you go to look for your incident response plan? You're not going to have access to it. Hopefully you've got a copy printed and saved somewhere or hosted on a third-party cloud environment. There's actually mobile apps that'll connect your breach response team remotely off systems, not on your company systems, to facilitate that process. But testing those kind of things, what are we going to do when the S hits the fan, so to speak? And how are people going to respond? Who are the people who we want to involve in our organization, and who are our third-party vendors that we're going to contact? So a tabletop exercise is kind of like a role-playing game or a choose-your-own-adventure scenario where we play out, from day one of an incident through the conclusion, remediation, notifications, and trying to fix going forward how we're going to improve and do things better. So, I guide clients through tabletop exercises. We get the board of directors or the president and CEO, the head of HR, the head of marketing, communications, all the responsible internal stakeholders in a room, and we say, here's what happened. You find out that $150,000 is missing from a bank account because a wire transfer was sent to China. How do we respond and investigate that incident? You find your system's encrypted one morning. What are you going to do? And by playing that out, we often reveal fundamental weaknesses, really basic stuff like, where's our incident response plan? Where do we have the phone numbers to call for the vendors that we want to use on the legal and IT side? How are we going to do that when our voice over internet protocol phone system has been shut down, right? So, kind of working through it in real time, or not real time, fast time, but over the course of a morning or a day, number one, it reveals weaknesses, and number two, it invests the responsible stakeholders with a sense of what's their role in this scenario and what are they going to have to be thinking about. How are you going to communicate to employees? How are you going to communicate to customers? How are you going to get systems back up and running? Bob, what's your perspective on tabletops?
Well, just to contextualize what you said, because everything you said is absolutely correct. But if you're going to convince, your managers or senior managers to participate, you have, just to be frank, if you have a group of managers and or senior managers that really are invested, then that question wouldn't come up. So assuming that there is a certain amount of resistance and like, well, do we really need to do this? The best way I've seen in the past is to have a consultant come in and basically have that discussion with all the senior managers. And just like what Devin said, have them role play through a scenario. And the best scenario to role play through, from my experience, which I've used in the past with senior managers, is to do a kind of a walkthrough, not necessarily a tabletop testing. Let's explore the ransomware situation, because ransomware will, bring out responsibilities like, okay, so if we decide to pay with Bitcoin, how do we do that? Well, it shouldn't be IT's decision to do that. That brings in the CFO's office, the CEO, and other stakeholders to make that decision. And if you're going to do that, how do you prepare for that? Do you go to a third party to pay for that, or do you create your own infrastructure to pay for that? Regardless, the CFO is going to be the one making those processes, because you're dealing with monies and other stakeholders. If the ransomware was instigated because someone internal did something that wasn't following policy, well, now you have to have HR involved as well as legal. What does this mean from an employment perspective? Well, how does HR deal with this, kind of in their sanction policies, and how do they do disciplinary actions? And let's assume the ransomware was brought in because it was done through a contractor with his computer was already infected and connected to the network. Well, now you have contractual issues. You have to have legal involved. You have a vendor management relationship problem. So you have a vendor management team. They have to get involved. The idea is to have someone who has, consultants typically have an aura of, we know everything, which is not true. But it's it's important to basically show why everyone needs to be in the team. So I don't know if that answers the question. I just want to underscore everything what he said is correct, but you really need to look at your senior managers, and the goal would be is to, okay, this is why you all have to be a part of this. Large organizations, you might have a split between senior managers and the tactical team, but it starts with the senior management being involved, either at a governance level, or maybe your structure is to have them involved directly, but they need to be, it needs to be interdisciplinary. You need to have, it's a business problem, not an IT problem. It's not even a security problem. It's a business problem because it has reputational effects, legal effects. It could affect finances. It could become a disaster. You name it. They need to be involved and make the call.
Hey, Brian, I'll touch on the ransom payments issue you brought up earlier, since we have a few minutes. Brian mentioned a North Carolina law that's, forbids certain public agencies from paying ransoms. And a lot of the business folks that I talk to say, I would never pay a ransom. I'm not going to be extorted by some criminal gang from overseas. And the perspective at the federal level is similar, right? The FBI doesn't want you to pay a ransom because you're feeding a criminal enterprise. These ransomware gangs overseas are incredibly sophisticated businesses. They have employees, they have management, and their goal is to infiltrate systems, encrypt systems, and get paid a ransom in Bitcoin or other untraceable cryptocurrencies. And the business perspective a lot of times is, I would never pay that. I think it's a mistake for government to forbid it, though, because unfortunately I've been in a variety of scenarios where if the option of paying a ransom is not on the table, the business would be crippled, or even worse, we've had situations with social services agencies and businesses that have health information, or even worse, we had a massive breach that involved information about at-risk children who had been victims of abuse. It contained reports about sexual abuse and identified victims of that type of conduct. The ransomware threat is no longer just that we'll encrypt your systems and you need to pay us to get a key. Very often, in fact, in most cases now, it's if you don't pay us the ransom, you won't get a decryption key, and we're going to leak all of your information on the dark web, where it's going to be available to be viewed or purchased by others. And when you're dealing with incredibly sensitive information that, if it leaked, could be very harmful to people, sometimes the only option is to pay a ransom to recover systems and to protect that data. Now you think, why would I trust these bad guys who encrypted my system to give me back a decryption key or to delete the data they stole? Like I said, these are businesses. On the dark web, there's websites that are essentially like Yelp that offer, you look at what's this restaurant like and how's the service there? There's review sites for ransomware gangs that tell you, 5 stars. I paid the ransom and I got a decryption key and it worked. They confirmed they deleted my data. And we're working on an incident right now where that was one of the first things we checked. Is this a reputable organization we're dealing with on the other side that we can trust to provide us with the customer service to decrypt systems and delete data, or not? And they want their reputation to be strong. They want to have good reviews, because if they have bad reviews and they give bad service, no one's going to pay their ransoms in the future. And they're trying to collect those ransoms. That's the business. So that's, that gets you into the weeds and gives you an idea of how complex this is. We coordinate with federal law enforcement on a lot of these incidents, and the official line from the FBI is, we don't want U.S. businesses paying ransoms, but we understand that sometimes it's the only option.
Hey, there's a good book out there. This is Bob, called Future Crimes. It's a little bit outdated, but it actually does a good job in detail with narratives that kind of supports what Devin just went through. So it does talk about businesses being, these underground organizations being some of them being an enterprise, global business. But if you're interested for more details, I would definitely check out that book. It's written by an FBI consultant by the name of Mark Goodman. So.
Awesome. Thanks, Bob. Going back to, yeah, the tabletop exercise, a lot of cyber insurance policies, if the organization is big enough, we're starting to see they'll actually offer a tabletop exercise through some of their preferred kind of legal and forensics partners. And then most of these cyber insurance policies, part of their panel providers, also they have ransomware negotiators that kind of specialize in it. So I know a lot of companies and business owners definitely feel emotionally involved. You know, I don't want to pay the bad guys. But oftentimes if you play nice with the bad guys and go along with them, of, you know, acting as if you're going to pay it, you can negotiate that payment down drastically, and maybe even buy yourself time to restore from backups. So with that in mind, I'll go ahead and end the webinar for everybody. Slides and recording will go out probably by the end of next week at the latest, likely sooner. But thanks for joining, and have a good week.